The room froze mid-breath when the VP said it. Sharp, clean, final. "Close the slide. You're fired." No raised voice, no hesitation. Just a sentence that sliced through months of work like it meant nothing. Screens still glowed, numbers still mattered. But suddenly, none of it did. She didn't argue, didn't rush, didn't defend. She simply looked at him the way you look at a deadline you've already passed. Calm, measured, almost detached. Then, quietly, almost politely, she said, "Check your inbox." It didn't sound like resistance. It sounded like timing. Somewhere between disbelief and irritation, a few people shifted in their chairs. One director glanced at his phone. Another smirked, assuming this was over. That the script had already been written. It hadn't. Because 7 minutes is a long time. When the outcome is already decided. The slide was still open. A dense grid of numbers, projections, risk buffers. Months of modeling compressed into a quiet rectangle of light on the wall. No one moved to close it. Not yet. It hung there like unfinished business, like a sentence interrupted in the middle of a word. The VP leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly tapping the table, the rhythm controlled, deliberate. Authority without volume, the kind that doesn't need to repeat itself. "Security will handle access," he added, almost casually, as if he were confirming a calendar invite. A few eyes shifted, subtle but telling. Not toward him, toward her. She didn't move from her spot, not immediately. Her laptop remained open, cursor blinking steadily, indifferent to hierarchy. She closed one tab, then another. No rush. No visible reaction. Just small, precise actions, like someone finishing a process that had already been scheduled long before this moment. Across the table, someone cleared their throat. Another adjusted their posture, suddenly aware of how thin the air felt in the room. It wasn't tension in the usual sense. It was something quieter, a misalignment. Because the numbers on the screen didn't match the tone in the room, and someone noticed. "Should we continue?" one of the directors asked carefully, eyes flicking between the VP and the projection. The VP didn't even look at the screen. "There's nothing to continue." That landed heavier than expected, because there was. Everyone in that room knew there was. The model on that slide wasn't just another quarterly update. It was tied to something larger. Something that had been circulating in fragments. Legal drafts, late-night emails, sudden calendar blocks with vague titles. A deal that hadn't been announced yet, but already had weight. And she had built the framework behind it. Not visibly, not loudly, but structurally. She finally closed her laptop. The soft click echoed more than it should have. Then she stood up. No dramatic gestures, no hesitation. Just a quiet, almost procedural movement, like someone leaving a room they already understood better than anyone else in it. As she reached for her bag, one of the senior analysts glanced at his phone again. His brow tightened, just for a second. Then he looked up, as if about to say something, but stopped. Not the right moment. Not yet. Near the end of the table, someone whispered, barely audible. "Did she send something?" No one answered, because no one knew. But the timing felt intentional. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and paused for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be called hesitation, but long enough to register presence. Then she looked directly at the VP. Not with defiance, not with anger, with certainty. "The inbox," she repeated softly, and then she walked out. The door didn't slam. It didn't even click loudly. It just closed. And for a brief moment, the room felt incomplete, like a system missing a critical input. A few seconds passed, then 10. The VP exhaled slowly, reaching for his tablet, already moving on. Or trying to. "Let's proceed with the next item," he said. But no one touched their notes. Because now, more than ever, the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. At the far end of the table, a phone vibrated. Once. Then again. A director picked it up, eyes scanning quickly. His expression changed. Subtly, but enough. He didn't speak. He just turned the screen slightly, toward the chairman, and in that small, almost invisible gesture, something shifted. Not loudly, not publicly, but irreversibly, because whatever had just arrived wasn't part of the plan, and that was only the first signal. The chairman didn't reach for the phone immediately. He let it sit there for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring the weight of whatever had just entered the room. Then, without a word, he turned the screen toward himself and opened the message. No notification sound, no dramatic pause, just a quiet shift in attention that pulled the entire room with it. The VP noticed. Of course he did. He stopped mid-sentence, not abruptly, but enough for the interruption to register. His fingers, still resting on the table, froze for half a second before resuming their rhythm. Slower now. Is there an issue? He asked, tone controlled, but tighter than before. No answer. The chairman was reading, and the longer he read, the quieter the room became. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was calculation. Because people at that level don't read emails during meetings unless the email changes something. And this one clearly did. Across the table, the same analyst who had checked his phone earlier leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse. Useless. The screen was angled just enough to keep its contents contained, visible only to the one person who now held the room's gravity. The chairman scrolled. Once. Then again. A document opened. A contract. The header alone was enough to trigger recognition in more than one person at that table. Not explicitly, but instinctively. The formatting. The structure. The legal tone that only appears when stakes cross a certain threshold. Someone shifted in their seat. Another reached for their own phone, too late. Because whatever this was, it hadn't been distributed. It had been directed. Where did this come from? The chairman finally asked, not looking up. The question wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with surgical precision. The VP leaned forward slightly. I'm not aware of... She sent it. The analyst said it before he could stop himself. Silence. Not awkward, not confused. Absolute. Because now there was a source, and more importantly, intent. The chairman's eyes moved across the document again, slower this time, not scanning, verifying, clauses, signatures, attachments, everything aligned. Then he stopped, zoomed in, read one line again, a very specific line. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What time was this received? He asked. 7 minutes ago, someone replied quietly. 7. The number landed differently now, not as coincidence, as precision. The VP straightened in his chair. If this is about the preliminary draft, it hasn't been approved. We're still reviewing. This isn't a draft. The chairman's voice didn't rise, but it changed. It lost something, flexibility. He turned the screen outward, just enough for the closest directors to see. A $200 million contract, not proposed, not pending, executed. Silence expanded across the table like a pressure wave. Because this wasn't just a document, it was leverage, and it had been activated. Who authorized this? Someone asked, barely above a whisper. No one answered, because the answer was already in the room, just no longer in the chair. The VP inhaled, slower now. We need to verify. It's already verified. The chairman closed the document, not abruptly, decisively. Then, finally, he looked up, not at the room, at the VP. And in that look, the hierarchy that had felt so stable just minutes ago shifted, not collapsed, shifted. The decision is revised, he said. No explanation, no elaboration, just a correction, clean, final, and devastatingly simple. Across the table, someone lowered their eyes. Another leaned back, exhaling as if they'd been holding their breath without realizing it. The analyst who spoke earlier stared at the table, replaying the last 7 minutes in his head. Because now it was clear. This wasn't reaction. This was design. Every second, every word, every step toward the door. The VP didn't respond immediately. For the first time since the meeting began, he had nothing to interrupt, nothing to control, only something to absorb. And in that moment, the room understood something critical. Authority doesn't disappear. It relocates. Quietly. Precisely. And always. On time. But what exactly was inside that contract would make everything that just happened look small? If you felt that shift, the moment when silence carried more weight than authority, then you already understand what most people miss. Because this wasn't about being fired. It was about timing, leverage, and knowing exactly when not to speak. And if you want more stories where power moves quietly, but changes everything, subscribe, like, and drop a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. Because the next chapter goes deeper than the room. The meeting didn't end. Not officially. No one said adjourned. No chairs scraped back in unison. No привычной деловой суеты, которая обычно заполняет паузы после резких решений. Но что-то завершилось. И все это почувствовали. The slide was still on the screen. Unchanged. Those same numbers, projections, risk corridors. Yet now they meant something entirely different. Not because they had changed, but because their context had. The chairman remained seated, fingers lightly resting on the closed tablet. He wasn't rushing to move forward. That, in itself, was a signal. When decisions are truly final, urgency disappears. Across the table, the VP adjusted his posture, slower than before. Controlled, calculated. But the rhythm had shifted. There was a fraction of a second too much between movements. Barely noticeable, but enough. Let's clarify the scope, he said, tone steady, as if rebuilding structure from scratch. This contract is already in effect. The chairman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A director leaned forward. We weren't copied on this. Exactly. One word, precise and loaded. Because not being copied wasn't an oversight. It was a filter. Only certain people had been meant to see it, and only at a specific moment. Someone at the far end finally spoke what everyone was thinking. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier? A pause. Not hesitation. Selection. Then the chairman answered, eyes still on the table. Not on any one person, but on the structure of the room itself. Because earlier, it would have been stopped. Silence. Deeper now, more informed. Because that wasn't speculation. That was acknowledgement. The VP exhaled slowly, leaning back again. If this bypassed internal approval. It didn't bypass, the chairman interrupted. Another pause. Then, it replaced. That word landed differently. Heavier. Because bypass implies error, replacement implies intent. Across the table, the analyst finally understood what had felt off from the beginning. The timing, the calm, the absence of defense. She hadn't reacted to being fired. She had already moved past it. The meeting room, with its glass walls and polished surfaces, suddenly felt less like a place of control, and more like a delayed checkpoint. Who else has this? Someone asked. Relevant parties, the chairman replied. Not more, not less. Which meant investors. Which meant external counsel. Which meant visibility. The kind you can't retract. The VP's fingers stopped tapping entirely now. For the first time, stillness wasn't a choice. It was a condition. He glanced at the screen again, at the slide that was no longer central to anything. Then, back at the chairman. This changes internal alignment, he said carefully. It corrects it. The answer came without delay. And that was the final confirmation. This wasn't a disruption. This was a recalibration. Outside the glass walls, someone passed by, unaware that inside, a hierarchy had just been rewritten without a single raised voice. Inside, no one reached for their laptops. No one resumed the agenda. Because there was no next item anymore. Only posledствия, measured, inevitable, and already in motion. One of the directors quietly closed his notebook, not because the meeting was over, but because the version of the company he had walked into that morning no longer existed. And somewhere beyond that room, far from the table, far from the voices, she wasn't explaining anything. She didn't need to, because the system was already responding, and what it would reveal next wasn't designed for this room at all. The corridor outside the meeting room was quieter than usual. Not empty, just muted, like a place where conversations had already happened and decided not to repeat themselves. She walked past the glass walls without slowing down. No glance back. No subtle check to see what had changed behind her, because she already knew. Timing doesn't require confirmation. Her phone remained in her hand, screen dark, but active. Not waiting, not refreshing. Already done. At the far end of the hallway, the elevator doors opened with a soft, mechanical precision. She stepped inside alone, pressed the button, no hesitation. The doors began to close, and then paused. A hand. Hold. It was one of the senior directors, not from her team, not someone who had spoken much in the meeting, the kind of presence that usually observes, calibrates, and only moves when the outcome is already clear. He stepped in, exhaled once, and let the silence settle between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, "That wasn't random." Not a question, a statement. She didn't turn to him immediately. Just a slight shift of posture, enough to acknowledge the conversation without inviting it. "No," she said calmly. The elevator started moving, a quiet descent. "You timed it to the minute," he continued. 7 minutes. 6 would have been early. That caught his attention. He glanced at her now, properly. Early for what? She finally looked at him, not long, just enough, for them to think they still had control. Silence, not uncomfortable, analytical, because now he was reconstructing the sequence in real time, the meeting, the interruption, the message, the contract, not as events, as a system. "You knew he'd cut you off," he said. "I knew he'd try." "And if he didn't?" A slight pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, "He always does." The elevator passed another floor. Numbers changing above the door. Quiet, indifferent. The director nodded slowly. Not agreement, recognition. $200 million isn't just leverage, he said. It's exposure. Yes. And exposure spreads. Yes. Another pause. This time longer. Because now they were no longer talking about the meeting. They were talking about consequences. "Who else has it?" he asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, "Enough." One word, but precise. Because in this context, enough didn't mean quantity. It meant irreversibility. The elevator slowed. Ground floor approaching. "You're not coming back," he said. Not a question. Again. She shifted her grip on the phone slightly. "No." The doors opened. Light from the lobby spilled in. Brighter, less controlled than the filtered tones of the meeting room upstairs. People moved. Conversations overlapped. The normal rhythm of a company still operating on the assumption that nothing had changed. Yet. She stepped out first. The director remained inside for half a second longer. "Then what was the point?" he asked, just before the doors began to close again. This time, she didn't pause, didn't turn, didn't slow down. "The correction," she said, and kept walking. Behind her, the elevator doors closed. Clean, final. Upstairs, in a room now filled with recalculated silence, phones were starting to light up. One by one. Not all at once, because systems don't react simultaneously. They propagate. A message forwarded, a clause reviewed, a name recognized, and somewhere in that chain, a realization that the contract wasn't the story. It was the trigger, and what it activated was already moving beyond anyone's ability to contain it. By the time the second wave of emails hit, the room upstairs had already stopped pretending it was in control. Phones were no longer checked discreetly. They were watched, held, tracked. Because now each vibration wasn't a distraction. It was data. The chairman didn't reopen the agenda. He didn't need to. The agenda had already been replaced by something far more precise: incoming reality. Legal is asking for confirmation, one of the directors said, eyes fixed on his screen. External or internal? The chairman asked. A pause. Both. That mattered. Because internal questions can be managed. External ones, signal exposure. Across the table, the VP remained still, but not composed in the way he had been earlier. This was different. Not loss of control, loss of timing. And in environments like this, timing is everything. When was this countersigned? Another voice asked. Earlier this morning. Before the meeting? Yes. Silence. Again. But now it carried a different weight. Because this wasn't a reaction to what happened in the room. This was a sequence that had already been executed before anyone took their seat. She locked it in before he spoke, the analyst said quietly, almost to himself. No one corrected him, because it was accurate. The chairman finally stood up, slowly, not to leave, to reset position. Pull the full distribution list, he said. Already doing it. Prioritize external recipients. That one instruction changed the focus instantly. Not who knows, but who matters. A screen at the far end flickered as someone mirrored incoming threads onto the display. Names began to appear: firms, advisors, stakeholders who weren't part of the internal chain of command. Visibility expanding, controlled, but irreversible. The VP leaned forward, finally breaking his stillness. We can contain this if we align messaging now. The chairman looked at him. Not dismissive, not confrontational, evaluative. No, he said. One word, flat. Because containment requires time, and time had already been spent. This is not a messaging issue, he continued. It's a position issue. That distinction settled heavily across the table. Because messaging can be adjusted. Position has to be earned back. And sometimes it can't. Another notification, then 2, then 5. Momentum, not chaotic, structured, exactly as designed. One of the directors zoomed into the contract again on the shared screen. Clause 11. Exclusivity window is already active. How long? 48 hours. The room absorbed that. 48 hours wasn't a buffer, it was a lock. A defined period where alternatives collapse and decisions crystallize under pressure. And termination? Someone asked. Not unilateral. Another pause. Deeper. Because now the shape of it was clear. This wasn't leverage for negotiation. This was architecture, pre-built, deployed. And now, running. The VP exhaled slowly, looking at the screen, then away from it. For the first time, there was no immediate counterpoint, no redirection, no interruption, just calculation, delayed. And that delay said everything. Who drafted this? One of the junior directors asked. The chairman didn't answer right away. He looked at the names again, at the structure, at the sequencing of events. Then, finally, someone who understood exactly when this room would be weakest. Silence. Not confusion. Recognition. Because now they weren't analyzing the contract, they were analyzing the absence, the space she had left behind, and what had filled it the moment she walked out. Outside, the company still moved. Emails sent, calls made, meetings scheduled. But inside this room, everything had already shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but definitively. The chairman closed the tablet again, not as an end, as confirmation. The decision stands, he said. No elaboration, no justification, because none was needed anymore. Across the table, no one objected, not because they agreed, but because the window to disagree had already passed, 7 minutes earlier. And somewhere beyond the building, beyond the glass, and the controlled silence. She wasn't watching. She wasn't waiting. She had already moved to the next position. Because the real outcome of this wasn't the contract. It wasn't the meeting. It wasn't even the decision. It was something quieter, more precise. The moment when everyone else finally realized they were no longer reacting in real time. They were catching up. And by then, the system had already chosen its direction.